Hey, this is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls. Let's talk about the changes made to the Relequen set this patch. A lot of people have been preoccupied with the Null Arca changes, but now that dust has settled and update 45 is out on consoles, we're seeing more concern about Relequen, which also got changed. Is it still good? How much damage have I lost? Do I need a new build? Good questions, but inevitably there's some misinterpretation and definitely some exaggeration of what's going on. Whenever there's any slight change in the patch notes, there's this funny temptation to declare the end of existence. People like to be dramatic, I guess. So I want to clarify that 1, yes, the set has become weaker in optimized conditions. 2, but the proc damage you get from Relequen is unchanged, and that's what made it good in the first place. 3, in unoptimized conditions, which is how most players do trials and dungeons, the new stats might be even stronger. And 4, let's remind ourselves that this is not an everywhere gear set. You should only be using it in specific circumstances anyway, and that hasn't changed. Here's the old Relequen tooltip next to the new one. You can see we lost 2 lines of critical chance, which is generally the stat line DDs are most excited to see. Weapon and spell damage is obviously still very welcome, but critical chance is statistically stronger, and 657 equates to 3% critical strike chance. So we're losing 6% of our critical hits, give or take, but we're gaining 258 weapon and spell damage, which makes those base attacks hit harder. Before looking at these stats individually, let's input the values into UESP's build editor, a great tool if you don't already know about it. Here's the damage formula, showing a stamina Necromancer, just as an example, with the old Relequen equipped. Let's say they're already at the penetration cap, so the new line of penetration won't make any difference here. The new Relequen loses 1096 stamina, plus modifiers, it loses 6% crit chance, and it gains 258 weapon and spell damage, plus modifiers. According to the build editor's damage formula, that's a 2.1% damage loss. That's not massive, but it does hurt. Now, obviously different classes and different setups will input slightly different values into this equation for crits, pen, weapon damage, and so on, and so you'll get slightly different results. And that 2.1% figure is about the maximum. In reality, it's probably never going to be quite that high. For example, a Magicka character never gained any damage from that perfected stamina line to begin with, so losing it is actually a good thing. If we take that out of the equation, the power reduction drops to just 1.1% for Magicka characters. And what about that new line of penetration? What if we're not at the penetration cap? Then that line isn't wasted and we can actually get something out of it. In that case, the stat changes become a net gain of 0.9% for stamina and 2% for Magicka characters. I ran all of these numbers through UESP's build editor, so I trust them enough to draw some conclusions. Already, I hope you can see from these numbers that anyone saying, this set is trash, they've nerfed it into oblivion, it needs to go in the bin, never use it again, is obviously mistaken. There's also the proc itself, the harmful winds dot. When you've got one priority target to focus on, and you can stay engaged on that target for the entire fight, this is when Relequen kicks ass. When it sucks is when people use it in the wrong type of fight. For example, if they've copied a build that has Relequen in it, but they haven't considered the fact that what they've copied is a single target boss setup, and they try to use that same setup in trash pulls, or in complex boss fights where you're switching targets, or where you can't stay on the main target consistently, stuff like that. Then Relequen just isn't worth using. And I think this is why some players don't understand the set and think it's always bad. ESO just doesn't work that way. The strongest sets are usually the most conditional. The more specific the conditions have to be, or the more demand it puts on you to trigger the effect of the set, the greater the reward for using it. At least that's the logic. There are plenty of fights where Relequen is not going to be the best option. Arcanists never use it, because they can't keep up the stacks. But in those fights where it was really strong in previous updates, there's a good chance it's still going to be one of the best options in the current update. Whatever made it good in that fight to begin with hasn't changed. You can already see proof of this on ESO Logs. If you check out prog groups where players were using Relequen last patch and are still using it this patch, you can see their damage has not plummeted overnight. the proc damage is the same, maybe even slightly higher, since Relequen is one of the few procs that cannot critically strike. So losing that crit chance and gaining pure damage stats on the tooltip actually makes the proc portion of the set stronger than it was. And there is another element to this. Once you start thinking about how our damage stats change from one situation to the next, it looks increasingly like this change was a nerf for endgamers, by which I mean optimized trial groups who do use this set sometimes, but it's probably a buff for the more casual players who use it for dungeon and trial bosses. Now, I'm not going to get super deep into the mathematics of this, but when we say that a line of crit chance is better than a line of weapon and spell damage, this is not an apples to apples comparison. Weapon and spell damage is a flat stat, which raises the tooltip damage of everything you do, right? Simple. Critical chance is more complicated because it's a percentage boost. Let's assume for a moment there's no RNG. 60% crit chance means that 6 out of every 10 of your hits will critically strike. But that doesn't mean very much on its own. When a regular hit becomes a critical strike, the default increase is only 50%, so a 20k hit becomes a 30k crit. Not bad, but not great either. But if we max out our critical damage stat at 125%, all those critical strikes will hit for 2.25 times their tooltip value. A 20k hit becomes a 45k crit, and that's when we really start to see the value of a higher critical chance over a flat stat increase. Don't worry, you're not supposed to keep all of this stuff in your head. That's why this is a video game and not a pen and paper RPG. But that's how these damage stats interact. And it's worth reminding ourselves of that because when we talk about a set's performance, we almost always do it in the context of ideal, optimized conditions, where we're either testing on a dummy or we're in a group which is properly prepped and comped, where everyone's supporting one another correctly, and support players will bring those setups that get us to the penetration cap and the critical damage cap. That's when you can expect those 20k hits to become 45k crits, and a higher critical chance is at its most valuable. Because for every extra % of critical chance we add, we're increasing our total damage by 1.25%. There's also the issue of inflated weapon and spell damage. In good groups, this can get up to 8,000 or more during combat. And when the numbers are so big, suddenly that 258 extra weapon and spell damage we get on the new version of Relequen doesn't seem like such a big deal. Of course, that 258 is subject to the same modifiers and multipliers as everything else, but it's fair to say that relatively speaking, the contribution of a weapon and spell damage stat line decreases as group power gets higher and higher, while the contribution of a 3% critical chance stat line does the opposite, as our crit damage stat rises to 125% and stays there more consistently. Make sense? Honestly, it doesn't have to, so long as I successfully explained why crit chance versus weapon damage is not an apples to apples comparison. Both stats are good and we need them both, but the relative value of these one-line gear bonuses does start to diverge as our groups become more polished and combat conditions become more optimal. And how often do we really play in those ideal, optimized conditions? Some of us are very lucky and we get to do that all the time, but most players do not, and they're the ones for whom these changes are less of a nerf and might even work out better. Personally, I still would have preferred it if they just changed the perfected stamina line and left the rest of the set as it is. To explain why they did it, in the patch notes the devs say, "We're taking a light sweep through a handful of sets this update to improve their stat lines to better reflect their centerpiece effects gameplay requirements and scaling." That reads to me like, the Relequen proc cannot critically strike, so it makes no sense to have 2 lines of crit chance on this set. Let's swap them for something else. I can see the logic, but from the perspective of players actually using the set, this was met with almost universal dismay. Despite the fact that, as we've seen, in some situations it's only a small nerf or even a buff. But still, a lack of optimization isn't something we should be aiming for or building around. And the penetration stat has been getting easier and easier to come by in even half-decent groups, so the addition of a pen line does feel a bit like a dead stat. Maybe bring back one of those crit lines? Eh, Zos? Anyway, that's my fairly brief take on this update to Relequen, and I hope it helps cut through some of the static and give you a better sense of how the set has changed, the type of fights where you should continue using it, and when it might be worth looking for something else to run. If you like these videos, help me make more of them. Ninja Pulls is a huge community that shares a deep and nerdy love of ESO and all Elder Scrolls stuff, and Maya and I are here to serve that community however we can, with events, training, stupid jokes, and info vids like this one. But we do need your support to do it, so please help us out. Become a member on YouTube, sub to our Twitch, throw us a couple of septims on Ko-fi or Patreon. We massively appreciate that, and I want to say a deep and sincere thank you to everyone who already supports us in this way. If you're not ready to take that step but you do like what we do here, tell a friend. That always helps, and I'm doing a refresh on all the damage classes right now with super detailed guides on YouTube and on the website, so there's gonna be something for everyone. Finally, if you like the sound of these optimized groups I mentioned during the video, join the Ninja Pulls Guild in-game, or one of the other great communities out there where experienced players are happy to share their knowledge and time. But if you're on PCEU or PCNA, Ninja Pulls is there, and we're open to players at any level. Obviously, the more experience you have, the more we can do together, but we do have events even for relative newbies, as well as trifecta progs at the other end. So check it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.